This video is the first in a series of tutorials for beginner double knitters. If you follow along with all the videos in this series, you will wind up at the end with this charming Mario coaster. Here's what the opposite side looks like. But for today, we're really just going to be talking about the anatomy of double knitting and what makes it different from other types of knitting. So you do not need any materials for this video, but if you would like to follow along, go ahead and knit 2 stockinette swatches of the same size. 4 things. First, knit your swatches with any size of yarn and needles, but use different colors. Second, cast on the same number of stitches for each. Third, stop knitting one on a right side row and the other on a wrong side row. Finally, slip both swatches right side up onto scrap yarn or circular needles, with both working yarns in the middle. So when most people talk about double knitting, what they're really talking about is double knitting stockinette. Because double knitting is a lot more versatile than many people think to start with. Using the same sort of techniques, it can be applied to textured stitches like seed stitch. It can be used for cables, for lace. There's really very few types of knitting that can't be adapted for double knitting. But as I said, most people are talking about double knitting stockinette. So to understand how double knitting works and what makes it the way it is, let's take a look first at stockinette and what makes it what it is. In stockinette, as most of you probably know, you knit on the right side, then you turn your work and purl on the wrong side. And the reason for that is because a knit stitch is, in essence, a backwards purl stitch and vice versa. With double knitting, we're actually folding these 2 pieces of fabric together. There goes one of my knitting needles, oh well. And you do a knit on the side that's facing you, and for every knit, there's a corresponding purl stitch. So you knit one here, and it looks like a knit stitch, and you purl one there, and on the other side, it looks like a knit stitch. Now, one of the things that frustrates people so much about stockinette is it has this distinctive curl. It always wants to curl. But with double knitting, you can actually anchor those 2 strands together, and these 2 sides will both be pulling in opposite directions, so it winds up being perfectly flat. So double knitting is basically a self-blocking fabric, which is kind of magical. Now, I'm going to go ahead and slip these 2 onto needles, or onto my number 7s here, to show you how it actually works. I'm apparently not great at counting because this one has one wider than this one, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, I'm going to go ahead, and slip these 2 pieces of fabric onto one needle as you would for double knitting. Slip one from this side, one from that side, one from this side, one from that side, and so on all the way to the end of the work. Here I am with both working yarns at the right side of the work. And don't worry, I'm going to be going over all of this much more slowly and in more detail when we start knitting our actual coaster. But for now, if you're following along, I'll go over it briefly. So I'm just going to go ahead and knit the first stitch with the corresponding color with both yarns in the back of the work, but only working this strand. Then, just as you would if you were doing 1x1 ribbing, you take your yarn to the front of the work and purl with just this other strand. I'm purling 2 together here to fix my earlier cast-on mistake. And you may notice that I wrap my pearls oddly. That's just because I'm a combined knitter. So I wrap my pearls that way and knit through the back loops. But for anyone following along, knit how you would normally knit and purl how you would normally purl. And then we're going to repeat the same procedure for the entire row. Move both yarns to the back. Knit one with main color. Move both to the front. Purl one with contrasting color. And I'm going to do that all the way to the end of the row. So here we are at the end of the row. After doing that whole row in double knitting, I'm going to do something that's going to horrify some of you and whip it off the needles. So you can see, even though I was using both strands as I went along, these are still two separate pieces of fabric. There's nothing connecting them whatsoever. Okay, I have now slipped the swatches back onto the needle in the right position for double knitting. Then I turn my work. Knitted some hair in there, because of course I did. Okay, so I'm going to show you what double knitting edges do for your work. Now, the very simplest way to do this, and this is not the prettiest way, but it is the simplest, you can just work those two stitches on the edge together. Just put your needle through both loops and use both strands this time. And since I've just been doing a knitted edge, I'm going to knit this row. And then I'm going to do the same thing I did on the other side, except I'm going to knit with my contrast yarn, bring to the front, and then purl with my main color. And that's doing the same thing as it was on the other side. Knitting is on the side that's facing, and purling makes what looks like a knit stitch on the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and work this row and do another edge stitch. Okay, so let's go ahead and take this off the needles again so I can show you what that did for the work. Now in the middle here, still two separate pieces of fabric, not connected. But on the sides it is now connected by those double knitted edges. And that's what keeps the two halves of your work nice and snug. The other place where double knitted fabric is held together, other than all of the edges, are these color changes. Wherever you switch from a non-contrast stitch, which is what we've been doing all along, these are all non-contrast stitches, to a contrast stitch, which would be anywhere where the color changes, right along those edges, it's like you're tying little knots holding it together. And in that way, the color work itself is being blocked between those little ties, just like the edges down here were holding together and blocked it that way. So I will put this back on the needles again. Up to this point, everything we've been doing is a non-contrast double knit stitch, which translates to a white square on a colorwork chart. And this is where things start to confuse people, because you have to start thinking of these two stitches as being half of one whole. It's called double knitting for a reason, because you have to do everything twice. So for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, taking you back to middle school physics there. And when you want to change colors, then you would do the exact opposite, meaning that on this side, you would knit with your contrasting color and then purl with your main color. I'm going to slip the edges onto some handy dandy stitch markers here just so I can fold this open and show you more easily later. Okay. And at first, I'm going to keep doing my non-contrast stitches. Knit with main color, purl with contrasting color. Just make sure that you're choosing one strand to actually work instead of both. Time to throw in some of those contrast knitting double knit stitches. So the first half of that is knitting my contrasting color. I bring them both to the front and purl with my main color. And I'm going to do the same thing for 4 or 5 stitches, whatever looks good. For those following along, work 2 or more non-contrast stitches. The exact placement doesn't matter as long as they're next to each other. Now I'm going to swap back to non-contrast stitches. So I'm going to knit main color, purl contrasting color to the end. Red this time. I will slip this one onto another stitch marker. If you're following along, feel free to keep practicing your edges if you want. This is just to make it a little easier to show you what's going on later. Okay. And then when I turn my work, a non-contrast stitch. A non-contrast stitch is the opposite, knitting with my contrasting color and purling with my main color. I'm just going to knit everything as it appears on my needle since I set up in the last row. So here I am at the color change. So I'm going to knit main color, purl contrast color. Then switch back to my non-contrast stitches. Now that I've gone a few rows, let's show you what the contrast stitches do for the work. Once again, here's my working yarn. Once again, these are not connected, and these are not connected. But once you get to that color change, you can see that it's held together every row. Now, I haven't really dissected a double knitted swatch like this since I first started double knitting, so I actually just learned something too, because I thought that at the bottom here it would be connected just like on the sides, but that is not actually the case. It's only right at the color changes that on the sides that you get any tacking down of those two fabrics. Well, that's cool. And this, you can see how it's happening. This is the equivalent of a float in double knitting. It's not going across the work as it would in other types of color work. It's going from one half to the other half. And when I talked about it being as if there's little knots holding that in place, what actually serves as a knot, keeping it snug to the other side, is the other stitch. You can think of it kind of like your shoelaces, holding the different sides of your shoes together. Now, there's one last thing I want to tackle today, and that's to help you understand how the colorwork gets mirrored onto the other side. And it's not just that the colors are mirrored, it's the image itself. Now let me show you with another double knitted project that's not symmetrical so you can really see what I mean. This is part of a scarf that I knitted earlier this year. It's got a portrait of Hera and a portrait of Zeus in the middle. And that's what it looks like on the wrong side. So there's Hera and there's Zeus, with the colors and the directions of the color work reversed. I have a lot of people coming up to me when I'm double knitting in public, because I do a lot of it in waiting rooms and places where everybody's killing some time. And I try to explain what I'm doing when people ask, and they're usually pretty much on board when I say you use 2 colors of yarn in a motion that's kind of like 1x1 ribbing. So it's 1 knit, 1 purl. And they're pretty much on board when I tell them that you can switch colors that way. But when I show them that it's mirrored on the other side, they tend to look at me like this. Which makes sense because it is not that intuitive unless you really kind of dissect it like this. So I'm going to put this back on the needles, and I'm going to pick one stitch pair and show you exactly how it works for getting to the other side of the work. I just did almost 3 rows of non-contrast stitches, which again, on the front of the work means knitting the main color and purling the contrasting color, and continuing to do that all the way across. And I stopped at 5 stitch pairs from the edge, and it's going to be a lot easier on you when you're following a chart to either just count the purls, because again, these are each half of 1 double knitting stitch, or to count as 1 and 2 and 3 and. It'll make it a lot easier to keep track of things. So I'm going to do a contrast stitch right here. And we're going to focus on this stitch pair as we go a few rows ahead. Here I am on the other side of the work, and I've done 5 double knit stitches again. So that's 4 non-contrast stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and this is number 5. And you recall at the beginning of all of this, when we just had 2 stockinette swatches, I told you that the 2 things you needed to do was have the same number in each swatch and to have the working yarn facing different directions. Because to be at the business end of the needle, that means that one had to be pointing to the right, and on the other side, it had to be pointing to the left. And that's exactly why your work is mirrored onto the other side, because these 2 stitches and all of the stitch pairs, they mate for life. They're like penguins. This is the Bert to this one's Ernie, the Wren to this one's Stimpy. It would be cruel to part them. And here I am on the right side of my work after a few rows like that, with all of the stitches being non-contrast stitches, with the exception of this one, 5 from the end. And that is a contrast stitch. So this would be a black square on the chart, and these would all be white squares on a chart. And that is the theory of double knitting and the anatomy of it. Join me for lesson 2, when we learn how to adapt any knitting cast on to be used with double knitting. We'll also learn about yarn management and start our coasters.